We're in Psalm 90 this morning. If you're a guest with us today, we're thrilled that you're here. I want to take a second, just if you, on the way in, we hope you received a warm welcome, as well as a copy of this book, We Want You Here. What this does is this helps us to communicate with you what a church does in introducing people to Jesus Christ and helping them to grow, helping people to grow in their faith in Jesus. We'd love to get to know you better through our Connect card. You can fill that out and drop it off with one of the team members in the lobby, or you can scan the QR code on the seat in front of you, and you can fill that out digitally there as well. In just a few minutes after we finish up today also, you may have seen it as we were coming in. There's a slideshow that Suzanne, one of our team members, threw together. And so there'll be some highlights from the trip there as well. If you want to check that out, we'll play it right after the service finishes. And so you can talk and chat and do whatever you need to do, but that'll be running on the screens. And so if you have any questions about any of that, you got people all over the place with these Serve Tour or Send Relief t-shirts on. I think they're just looking for an excuse to wear t-shirts to church. To which I said, hey, listen, there are people wearing t-shirts without an excuse, but that's fine too. Hey, listen, we're just glad that you're here. Listen, whatever you're wearing, we are glad that you're here. Listen, we believe that the gospel of Jesus Christ is for everybody. And so we are just thrilled to be able to gather together to open the Word of God and to be able to dig in here to Psalm 90. As we get into this 90th Psalm, one of the things that we've talked about consistently throughout this book is that the Psalms are unique within the Bible and that they are not written by just one author, but they're a compilation of writings. And so through the Psalms, there are 150 Psalms that are put together making up this book. Now, those 150 Psalms, about a little under half of them are written by a man named David, who is a king in Israel. A number of them are what we call orphan psalms. We don't know who wrote them. And then others were written by men like Solomon, who we studied last week. He wrote the Psalm 72 that we studied last Sunday. This week, this psalm is a psalm of a man named Moses. This would make this one of the older psalms throughout the entire book. And this man, Moses, to understand what's happening in this passage, I think one of the keys to kind of turn the lights on for us is knowing who Moses was. Moses was this man who was born in Egypt, but he was a Hebrew child, an Israelite. He was not an Egyptian, but the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. He was born in this time frame where his parents were slaves and their parents had been slaves. For generations, this had taken place, hundreds of years to this point. And now Moses is born under a time when they were told that any of the male children born among his people were to be executed, were to be killed. And so Moses' mother, a godly woman, said, I cannot submit to this and stand by. And so she hid her child, Moses, as he was young. As he became older, the story goes that she took Moses and she placed him in a basket on the river, where he was then discovered by the daughter of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And so he is now, Moses, he is adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. He becomes a grandson of the king of Egypt, the most powerful man in the world at the time. And so he's raised with every luxury that the world can give. And as he grows older, he understands that he is one of the Hebrews, not one of the Egyptians. He begins to have a heart for and a passion for. But through a series of events, he kills an Egyptian man and he is exiled chased out of Egypt, fleeing for his life. He returns a number of years later as God calls him and says, Moses, you will go back to Egypt and you will be the one that I use to deliver my people from slavery. And so he goes back into Egypt, the place that he had been brought up, the place that he had fled in shame, the place that God was working and moving among his people. As he goes back into Egypt, you may be familiar with the story of the Exodus, these plagues that God allowed to come into the land. And Pharaoh consistently says, I will not let my people go. But Moses, through the power of God, through God's direction, continues to call for the deliverance and the freedom of the people of Israel. Finally, through the Passover, the firstborn son of the Egyptian families, they died, they were killed. Israel was finally set free and released. And as they go out into or towards the promised land, the people of Israel begin to complain and begin to doubt God, as we so often do. There's such a great analog that I hate to admit reflects us all too well. And so as they are traveling through the wilderness en route to this land that God had promised to their ancestors that he would set aside for them, they go and they end up in the wilderness. And in the wilderness, they have this opportunity to go into the promised land. God says, here it is. And they send out 12 men into this land, 12 spies to go look at this promised land. These spies come back out, and the overwhelming majority of them say, you guys are not going to believe what's in that land. Giants, peoples, that they would crush us if we ever set foot in it. And so the people of Israel faithlessly pull back from the promise that God had given to them. And so God says, fine, if you don't want it, I'll give it to your children. And for 40 years, the Israelites live and wander in this wilderness, this desert, outside of the land of promise. For 40 years, they live in these tents that they had brought with them out of Egypt. For 40 years, they dwell in these temporary places, picking up and moving as God directs and as God commands. A transient people, a people without a place to call their own. This group of what's believed to have been 1 million plus Israelites setting up camp, tearing down consistently over a period of an entire generation. And so Moses is blessed and cursed to lead this people. And even as he does, he writes this psalm. And so I want you to imagine with me, as we read through this, picture a people living in tents, picking up and moving consistently. All that they know is built on these temporary homes. Psalm 90, verse 1. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. He continues and he says, you return man to dust and say, return, O children of man. For 1,000 years in your sight, or but as yesterday when it's past, or as a watch in the night. You sweep them away as with a flood. They are like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. For we are brought to an end by your anger. By your wrath we are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. For all our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength, 80. Yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone and we fly away. Happy Sunday, guys. You guys encouraged? Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you? Watch this in verse number 12. So teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. Return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, and for as many years as we have seen evil. Let your work be shown to your servants, and your glorious power to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. As Moses opens up this book, he begins with this theme that we touched on earlier in our time of prayer. Lord, you have been our dwelling place to all generations. See, in the story of Moses and in much of his life, there was a lack of permanence. There was a lack of consistency and stability. And instead of bemoaning this fact, instead of only writing the psalm to complain to God about this, what is his prayer to God? He says, Lord, you are our dwelling place. You see, hopefully your home is more sturdy than a tent. I hope that is the case for you. But even in the moment that we feel like all of our lives are temporary, those days where we just feel like everything is upside down, even in the middle of those things, God is our permanence. God is our permanence. See, the older I get, the more I dislike change. How many of you feel me? The older we get, the more we like our stability and our predictability. We get a little crusty. There's inertia sets in. We don't want to get up and move and do these things. We don't have the patience. We don't have the energy. We've kind of begun to change ourselves. See, the only thing that's constant in life is God. What's wrong with some of you people? I'm just kidding. Set you guys up. The only thing constant in life is change, right? You hear the statement, the saying. And God is also this constant in our life, is he not? So much of our life is filled with change. And even here, if I can get ahead of us just for a moment, Moses is writing and he says, the days of our life are 70 years. Maybe you're strong and it's 80. Some of you guys are on overtime right now. Congratulations. Listen. That's what Moses writes, the days of our lives. What in our life lasts for 70 or 80 years? Name the thing. Some of you have lived in the same home for a couple decades. Some of you, I know there are marriages in here that have gone for 50 plus years. That's amazing. But listen, what lasts our entire life? The fact is at the end of the day, it's all temporary, is it not? It all lasts but for a moment. And we don't even control that moment. There are some in here, we've walked through the grieving process together. I've buried spouses and parents. Listen, we've walked through those moments. We understand that even those lives that are intertwined with ours are no more permanent than we are. You say, wow, this is a hard word. I know. But it helps us to understand. This is the point of the psalm here that Moses is writing. Moses is looking around. I mean, just picture him for a moment. Where is he writing this? Maybe he's writing it from his tent. Maybe he wandered outside the camp a little bit and he's looking out and saying, Lord, I'm tired of the dirt. I'm tired of the sand. I'm tired of the temporary. I'm too old for this. I mean, Moses was 80 when the Exodus started. He's pushing 120 by the time it finishes. He was too old for this. And yet that's his life. And he writes and he says, Lord, you are my dwelling place. You're the place that I abide, even if the location geographically that I am in is different from day to day and month to month and year to year. You are my dwelling place. You're that stability. And understand God is our permanence in all generations. You see, you and I look at generations as this period of time. We don't outlast our generation, not by much, if at all. But God is still in it. He has not given up on your generation. Even if your generation's been around for a while, he has not quit on you. He has not given up on the generation that is to come. He has not given up on the generations that are yet to be born. He is the dwelling place through all generations. And he even Moses writes this, and it's really interesting. He says, before the mountains were brought forth. It's like saying before the mountains were born, this is who you were. Before you formed the earth and the world, and said, what does he say? From everlasting to everlasting. You are God. As he continues, look at verse number 3. He highlights the permanence of who God is, and he says, you return man to dust. And say, return, O children of man. For 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. You sweep them away as with a flood. They are like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. And so we see Moses speaking about God's permanence, and he says this, 1,000 years. And he gives this list of what 1,000 years is like. If I had to ask you, help encapsulate how long is 1,000 years, that's tough for us, isn't it? It's difficult for us. Because 1,000 years, can I say this? I don't think it's controversial. It's a long time. It's a long time. It's been a while. I mean, you think of the things you learned about in American history class. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, that was less than 1,000 years ago. What was going on in the world in the year 1024? Any historians know offhand? All right, Google it later. All right. It's a long time. That's my point. And so what we see here, he compares these things to God. He says, listen, 1,000 years to you, it's like yesterday. How many guys yesterday feels like a long time? Some of you guys had long days yesterday. And so you're like, what kind of? But it's gone now. You can't rewind it and get it back. It's in the past. We look at it, he says 1,000 years, it's like a watch in the night. A watch is this period of a few hours that would take place overnight. You know what you were doing through watches last night? Hopefully, sleeping. My kids, sometimes they'll go to bed, and if you have young kids, you remember what it was like having young kids, they'll be like, how long until tomorrow? You know what I tell my kids? I said, shorter when you go to sleep, right? Because, man, we close our eyes. Once we're gone, we wake up and we look at the clock, we look at our phone, we try to see if it's daylight out. We have no idea. Time just passes. And Moses is writing and saying, listen, 1,000 years to you, it's like, oh, it's gone. Oh, yep, there it was. You and I, we are so confined in our idea of time that we don't grasp this because it's so big to us. But to God, it's like, oh, 1,000 years. Yeah, okay. It's this moment that he is above and beyond and around. He compares it to a flood that comes and goes. And one that washes in and then washes out as soon as it came in, as quickly as it came in. He compares it to a dream. One that, if you wake up, you have this vivid dream and it's gone by the time you realized it happened, right? You got a foggy and you're like, wow, that was strange. And then later you're like, hey, honey, I had the weirdest dream. And they're like, what was? And you're like, yeah, it's a great question. I don't know. It's just weird. That's what it is. He says, these are the things that we can relate to that are just kind of there and then gone. And God, these thousands of years, they don't affect him the way that they do us. And then he compares them to the grass that fades, that flourishes, then fades again. This grass is as fickle as we are. Charles Spurgeon, he says, this grass, what's amazing about it is it's sown, grown, blown, mown, and gone. That's the life of the grass. That's what we're compared to. That's what we are. All our days pass away. Moses was living in this moment where it felt like God's wrath was just ever upon them. That God's wrath was just over them and they were unable to escape it. And so he says in verse number 7, he says, we are brought to an end by your anger. By your wrath, we are dismayed. Remember, he's been turned out from the promised land because of the failure of faith. He says, you set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. All our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength, 80. Yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone and we fly away. Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you? And so he speaks and he says, listen, we've spent our days understanding your wrath. Their unwillingness to follow led to this wandering, led to destruction. His wrath kept them out of the land. Their sin was before him. There are no secrets in his presence. We spoke a few weeks ago. We were reading through Psalm 51, and we were walking through biblical confession. And remember, as we talked about biblical confession, as we look at what this is, we're not telling God something new about us. We're aligning with him about what we know is true. We're confessing that we agree with him about our sin and our shortcomings and our failures. And so here Moses, as he's repenting, he's agreeing with God about their sin. He says, our years come to an end. We can plan for 70. Maybe by strength we'll get to 80. Technologically, even today, 80 is much more common, but we still have our limits. Life expectancy in America today, 77 and a half years. There we are. That's what we can plan for. That's what we can kind of use as a gauge. In those 70 and 80 years, Moses writes, he says they're filled with difficulty, and then they're gone. Happy Sunday, guys. Really encouraged today, huh? They're hard and they're gone. Some days you get up and you're just like, man, life's kind of hard. Life's kind of tough. Yeah. How many of you, your back hurts? Right? It's unanimous. It's difficult and then it's gone, Moses says. And for those in the wilderness, I just want you to remember this 40 years, these are not 40 years of all joy and pleasure. God is providing food for them, manna and quail and these incredible things, water from rocks. God's doing incredible stuff in their midst, but they're still living in a desert, in a wilderness. They're still going from place to place. And follow with me, every stop they're making is a cemetery. An entire generation is passing away in these wilderness wanderings. They're burying moms and dads and aunts and uncles and grandparents. This is a difficult stage in the story of the people of Israel. A generation passing on without seeing this land of promise. Moses and many others continue to face the consequences of their sinful behavior. So Moses writes and he says, who considers the power of your anger? And oftentimes as we look at the Bible, we like to picture a God where there is no anger present. We only ever see and receive and understand his love. But in reality, anger is not the opposite of God's love and God's care. Apathy would be. But God cares enough that he hates sin. He hates sin. He hates the things that destroy his children and that riddle them and that tear them down. He despises those things, and he wants such good for us that he can't help but, it's in his nature and his character, that there be wrath and anger in response to sin. But at the same time, I want you to understand when we talk about God's anger, that God's anger is not like ours. God's anger is not like ours. How many of us, when we get angry, we say something or we do something that we later regret? If I asked you when was the last time you got angry and did something you regret, many of us, we could look at days and be like, what day is it? Sunday? Okay, so we could point to a time, and maybe that day is Sunday. The fact is that as we look at God's anger is not like ours. It's not an impulsive reaction. God doesn't suddenly get triggered like we do. We're not pushing God's buttons, but his anger and his wrath is poured out on sin. But even still, in the middle of God's anger and God's wrath, he doesn't stop being the all-knowing, all-wise, all-loving, all-caring God. You understand me? He doesn't put aside his other qualities in those moments and then wake up from this fugue state going, wow, what just happened? He is always in control. He is always knowledgeable and understanding. But the fact is that sin merits wrath. How many of you guys, if I'm going to say a word and I want you to give me thumbs up, thumbs down, how you feel about it? You ready? Difficult task. So if it's good, we go. If it's bad, we go. You guys ready? Cancer. Most of you guys don't like cancer. I hate cancer. Why? Because you've watched family members and friends fight this terrible disease. You've watched people struggle and lives end as a result of this thing. And we hate it. Many in this room, you have personally battled this disease. And you hate it. And you should. Because if you love someone that this disease is infecting and tearing down and just killing in front of you, you hate it. God looks at our sin and says, I hate that because I love them. You hear me? It'd be easy. If God didn't care for us, then why would God care about sin? But these two things have to exist together. God's love and God's wrath and anger towards sin have to exist together because he cares for us. In fact, you know how much he cares for us? He gave his son Jesus to come as the only way that our sin can be forgiven, that we can be cleansed from it. And so the Son of God, Jesus Christ, born of a virgin, lived a sinless life, yet gave himself as an offering for our sin. And that wrath of God that we deserve is poured out on Jesus Christ. That's the good news of the gospel. Jesus in my place. I deserve that death that Jesus died, and yet he came and laid his life down for me and rose again 3 days later. And so here Moses, he speaks of this anger of God, but we have to grasp and understand his anger is so unlike ours, not impulsive, but filled with wisdom in the middle of his execution of it. Which leads us to the point where we ought not suppress or tempt God, but be grateful for his goodness and his grace. In fact, the Bible tells us it is by his mercy that we are not consumed. And he has shown all of us his grace through his son, Jesus Christ. And how does Moses wrap up this psalm? Verse 12, teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. Teach us to number our days. This whole last paragraph, these last 6 verses, are Moses' requests of God. And I want you to see them. We're going to kind of lump them together, but I want you to see them this morning. Teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. So what does he say? He says, teach us, Lord. Remind us how frail we are. Remind us how temporary we are. Remind us that our days will come to an end so that we may abide in your wisdom. Return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servants. So we praise for God's return. Come to us. Watch in verse 14. He says, satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Verse 15, make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us and for as many years as we have seen evil. And this is one of the blessings of the Christian life, is that we understand our hope is not in this life. Because even though our days are filled with hardships and difficulties, there will come a day that we will see him face to face. We will be like him because we will see him as he is. The Bible tells us that to be absent from this body is to be present with the Lord. And so we wait and we hope for that day. And like the Apostle Paul, he prays and he calls out, use this word, Maranatha. Even so, come, Lord Jesus. We long for you. And so we wait, knowing that there will be days that so far outnumber our days of hardship. There will be days where sin is no more, has no power over us, no influence in us. And one day we will be like him. And so he prays, satisfy us, make us glad. And then watch what he prays in verse 16. Let your work be shown to your servants and your glorious power to their children. How many of you want to see God work? You want to see God work? We desire that. When God is moving and in those moments that we can see it and get this, I think you all understand with me. At any moment, God's doing thousands of things in our lives, right? And we understand and we see like 3 of them, I think is how John Piper phrases it. At any moment, tens of thousands of things, and we're aware of like 3, okay? But man, when we see those 3, it's pretty great, isn't it? We see, God, you're opening doors that I never thought would be opened. God, you're moving in their life, and I never thought you would do that. God, you're meeting needs, and you're satisfying, and I had no idea that that was possible except through you, and here you are. And so it's incredible as God works and as he changes lives. And so Moses prays, and he says, just let your work be shown to your servants. Let us see what you are doing and your glorious power to their children. I love that my kids get to witness and see the things that God is doing. It's incredible that they at their young ages have been able to watch as friends, as those that they know make decisions to follow Jesus and respond in obedience to him. And it's incredible to be able to open their eyes that they may see the goodness of God. And then he prays, let the favor of our Lord God be upon us and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. You see, when we do work, when we follow God, when we work with our hands, whatever it might be, we desire something to stay, don't we? The tasks that are consistently undone frustrate us. Again, parenting metaphor, it's the stage of life I'm in. I'm sorry, forgive me. You follow your kids around picking stuff up, and you're like, I just cleaned this. Maybe for some of you, you follow your husband around. Okay. Too far? All right. Too close to home. All right. Pain point there for a minute. Okay, we'll walk away. Now we'll dive in. Listen, we want our work to be established, don't we? We wish that everything that we did just would be forever anchored. But we can't do that. That's not in our power or our ability. But it is in God's. You see, as Moses is praying all of these things, help us to number our days and give us wisdom. God, return. God, satisfy us. God, make us glad. God, let us see your work, pour out your favor, and establish our work. Those are all things that you and I cannot do. You understand that? You can't satisfy yourself. You cannot gain wisdom on your own. You cannot establish your work forever. These are things that are beyond our control. But follow with me. Jesus has done what you can't do. Jesus has done what you cannot do. He has already worked and he is already working in ways that you and I are incapable of doing on our own. And is that not the Christian life? This is the grace that we have been saved by. When we look at the gospel of Jesus Christ, the death, burial, and resurrection for our sin, we look at this and we say, this is how we are saved. This is how we can get to heaven or have a right relationship with God. And yes, 100% that's true. Jesus himself says, John 14, I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. It's an exclusive gospel. But understand that the gospel is not the end of the Christian life. Our salvation is not the end of, although it affects our end. But the gospel is the means by which we are born again. Does birth happen at the beginning or the end of a life? It's not a trick question. It's the beginning. It's the beginning. When we believe in Jesus Christ, it's the beginning of our Christian life. The entry point is the same grace of God by which we were born again that we continue to live. Understand me, church, we don't outgrow the gospel. You don't get too mature suddenly for the gospel or too knowledgeable about. No. Our entire Christian lives are spent learning about the gospel and knowing it more fully. And so as we look at Moses' words, what is he crying out? What is he praying? He's saying, God, establish me in your truth. You see, he didn't know exactly how Jesus would come, but he knew that one day God would fulfill his promise and deliver his people. He knew that one day God would rescue them and he would provide that perfect Passover lamb. He didn't know all of the details yet, but he was looking forward and saying, God, one day you're going to do these things because I know you. And you're the only one who can satisfy. You're the only one who can be my safety. You're the only one who can be my permanence. And even though I'm living in a tent in the desert, born into slaves, raised in a palace, living in the desert, Moses' life, you're my dwelling place. You're my dwelling place. In the middle of all of that confusion, in the middle of all of that wandering, and I don't know where next is, he says, you're my stability. You're my anchor. And can I tell you, you can't have a better one. Because Jesus, he tells this parable. He speaks of these two men. They're building their homes, and they're looking for places to build. And one of them goes out and he finds a space, and it's a little sandy, but man, you know what? I like the location. And so he builds. Another man says, hey, you know what? There is this stone that would just be perfect. And he goes and he builds. Well, one day the rain comes. The storms of life wander in. And when the morning comes, one house is still standing and the other has collapsed. Which one do you think it is? Well, the house that was built on sand is no more. Its foundation was not dependable. Can I tell you, the foundation of your life matters? Because the hard times in life will come. I can't control it, and neither can you. The health diagnosis, the unemployment, the fractured relationships. You can't prevent them. But when those times come, where is your foundation? Kids, can I share with you? When your foundation is built on another human being and something happens, what do you have left? We don't like to think about those things, but this whole psalm is about stuff we don't like to think about, isn't it? Teach us to number our days. Why? That we can apply our hearts to wisdom. The only foundation that's worth building on is Jesus Christ. The only foundation worth building on is Jesus Christ. He's the same yesterday. He's the same today. He's the same forever.